August 1, 2007. At approximately 6:05 p.m., the I-35 bridge, one of the busiest in Minneapolis, collapsed, plunging hundreds of cars into the water below, killing 13 and injuring 145. Regular inspections had frequently raised concerns about its structural integrity, and as far back as 1990, 17 years before the disaster, the federal government had given the bridge a rating of structurally deficient. Since this disaster, more than 75,000 other U.S. bridges have also been given this classification. And it's not just bridges. In 2024, the average American spent 11 hours in blackout. Every 2 minutes, a water main bursts somewhere in the country, and 4 in 10 roads are now rated poor or mediocre. All whilst the rail network has nearly halved since its peak. America is falling apart, not metaphorically, but physically. Meanwhile, China, its biggest rival, is busy building the future. High-speed rail, mega-cities, and new infrastructure projects, all popping up in years, sometimes months. Even though China is still developing, this gap is widening fast. In 2022, Washington made a last-ditch effort to reverse this trend, a $1.2 trillion plan to rebuild the nation's crumbling infrastructure. But as big as that number sounds, it may have only delayed the inevitable. Millions of aging systems are reaching the end of their life, just as new ones are needed to meet rising demand. America now faces a brutal paradox. Fixing what's broken will cost several $trillion, but doing nothing would cost more than twice that. The economy would lose an estimated $17 trillion by 2043, more than the entire Eurozone produces in a year. America is left with two choices: spend and sink even more into debt, or let the decay continue. This all raises the uncomfortable question: how can the richest country on earth no longer afford to hold itself together? This might all seem overdramatic, but infrastructure really is that important. The latest estimates show that poor infrastructure costs the U.S. economy around $3,300 per household every single year. Altogether, that adds up to roughly $2 trillion in economic losses over the next decade if nothing changes. Of course, it probably doesn't surprise you that the U.S. doesn't really have the best infrastructure in the world. Just take a look at this map. It shows all of the passenger rail lines spanning across the continent of Europe, with routing connecting basically every major city. Then compare that to the U.S. and it's almost embarrassing. But what you might not know is that America wasn't always like this. In fact, going back to the 1950s, it actually had one of the best infrastructure systems in the world. By the end of the decade, the U.S. had built more miles of paved road and rail networks than every other developed nation combined. In a weird way, the country's ability to do this was really thanks to an economic crisis, the likes of which the world had never seen. By 1933, the peak of the New Deal infrastructure, America had been stuck in the Great Depression for more than 3 years. Unemployment had hit 25%. Industrial production had collapsed by nearly half, and more than 9,000 banks had failed. It was a level of economic devastation that gave the government both the political cover and the public support to take radical steps to pull the country out of the crisis. And later that year, that's exactly what they did. When FDR passed the New Deal, it was the largest economic intervention in U.S. history, costing the equivalent of over $800 billion in today's money. By the end of the decade, roughly $1 in every $3 spent by the federal government was going toward New Deal initiatives. But rather than just giving people money directly or using it to bail out businesses like governments tend to do today in a crisis, they chose to invest in infrastructure. This then relied on special planning powers that let federal government override local pushback and keep projects moving, something modern governments have found impossible to replicate. And it's from this wave of investment that a lot of the major infrastructure landmarks in the U.S. come from: icons like the Golden Gate Bridge, the Hoover Dam, and the Lincoln Tunnel. That approach was so successful that presidents from both parties would end up doing the same thing for decades. From Eisenhower's interstate highways to Kennedy's massive airports. But while this gave the country some of the best infrastructure in the world, it did create some other issues. All of this long-term investment came with a massive price tag, and once government spending had grown to support it, it became almost impossible to cut back in other areas. Welfare, entitlement programs, and countless smaller agencies all expanded alongside these big projects. By the 1980s, the size of the federal government as a share of the entire economy had nearly doubled. That led to a mounting backlash, and it helped propel Ronald Reagan into office on a promise to slash that spending. And that's exactly what he did, cutting non-military discretionary spending by a third during his time as president. But in doing so, he also slashed federal infrastructure budgets, cutting funding for transportation, water systems, and public transit by roughly the same amount. So for the next 20 years, public investment in America's infrastructure flatlined, drifting far below the levels that had once powered the country's rise. Now, for a while, this wasn't really noticeable. Major infrastructure projects often take decades to complete, and it's relatively easy to paper over the cracks of existing systems by repaving highways and patching up bridges, even if the underlying structure is decades past its intended lifespan. But by the early 2000s, some real problems started to emerge. Nearly a quarter of all U.S. bridges, for example, were considered structurally deficient, the worst figure for decades. But despite that, the U.S. was still spending less than 2% of its GDP on infrastructure. Less than half of what it was in the 1960s. It was clear that America would need something major to happen to start seriously investing in infrastructure again. Before we look at how America fumbled the ball here, I wanted to mention today's video sponsor, Cape, the privacy-first mobile carrier rethinking what secure phone service should look like. Cape gives you premium nationwide coverage without tracking, profiling, or selling your data. It was built by telecom and cybersecurity experts who wanted a carrier designed around privacy from the ground up. Most carriers collect personal information and hold onto your metadata for years, but Cape doesn't ask for your name or address, and it automatically deletes call logs after 60 days. And because they run their own cloud-based 4G and 5G core network, the data stays under their control instead of being pushed through legacy systems full of vulnerabilities. The feature that really stands out is their SIM swap protection. Instead of relying on customer service reps or PINs, your number is secured with a 24-word recovery phrase that only you control. There's no insider risk and no easy way for someone to hijack your number. It works more like protecting a digital asset wallet than dealing with a phone again. Every plan also includes enhanced signaling protection to block surveillance attempts, encrypted voicemail, and the option to bundle Proton VPN Plus and Proton Unlimited for just $1, which rounds out to a genuinely strong privacy setup. Cape is still in beta, but if you want to lock down your number and your privacy, switch to Cape using my promo code INVISIBLEHAND33 to get 33% off your first 6 months of Cape. Click the link in the description to learn more. Now, let's get back to how America began falling apart from 2008 onward. And in 2008, that's exactly what happened. A crisis in the financial sector caused the U.S. economy to shrink by more than 4% while unemployment spiked to over 10% for the first time in decades. As bad as it sounds, it was also something of a golden opportunity. The government knew that it would need to spend enormous amounts of money to pull the economy back out of recession. And it also needed to spend huge amounts of money fixing its crumbling infrastructure. So just like FDR did in the 30s, the government had a rare opportunity to kill two birds with one stone. But the thing is, they actually ended up doing the opposite. Instead of a new wave of public works, the vast majority of stimulus spending went towards bailing out the financial sector. About $700 billion was spent stabilizing major banks alone. Meanwhile, only around 6% of total stimulus funds went to infrastructure investment. It's obviously impossible to know whether this was the right call, and it's something which economists are still debating today. But what we know for certain is that it meant that unlike after the Great Depression, the country had spent its way out of a financial crisis without any new infrastructure to show for it. In part because of this, America has been stuck in the last couple decades with some of the worst infrastructure in the developed world. Decades of underfunding have left over 43% of public roads in poor or mediocre condition, costing the average driver around $1,400 a year in extra repairs and wasted fuel. Those same crumbling roads help cause around $40,000 deaths every year, a far higher rate than anywhere else in the developed world. There would still be the best estimates are now putting the cost of fixing all of this at around $15 trillion, in theory, equivalent to the entire government budget for more than 2 years to sort this out. Now, it's not like this issue has gone totally unnoticed. After months of haggling, Biden did manage to get the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that Congress in 2021. This kind of at $1.2 trillion. It was the biggest infrastructure initiative in American history, all to be spent between 2022 and 2026. Ways of investment, and to be fair, it did move the needle off the table. Since 2021, the country's infrastructure rate has improved from a C- and all the way up to a C, the best rating in years. Had to be massively. The thing is, it's not nearly enough to cover what America actually needs. To be fair, the Republicans might not be entirely wrong about the politics. Polling consistently shows that most Americans would rather the government did less and cut taxes rather than raise them to expand the state. A big part of that comes from America's long cultural tradition of skepticism towards government power. Something which separates the US from Europe in a way that not many people really understand. Either way, big structural reform on the scale of the New Deal just isn't something the US political system is capable of delivering today. Of course, there's always the option of borrowing money to try and fix this issue, but that again is a very risky strategy. National debt is already well over 100% of GDP, in large part thanks to all of the stimulus spending during 2008 and co. That means that the government is already having to spend a huge amount on their interest for these past loans, about 10% of their annual budget. With such a tight budget, it becomes politically incredibly hard to invest in things for the future, even if everyone agrees they're desperately needed. But as big as the underinvestment problem is, it's only half the story. Because even if the government did throw far more money at the problem, it's not actually clear it would make things any better. A lot of America's most ambitious projects, like California's high-speed rail, have become derailed, not by a lack of funding, but by how incredibly inefficient the whole system has become. When it was first proposed in 2008, the entire project was supposed to cost around $35 billion. The idea was to build a high-speed rail line running from San Francisco in the north down through the Central Valley and all the way to Los Angeles and Anaheim in the south, effectively connecting the state's two biggest population centers with trains running over 200 miles per hour. On paper, this was going to save hundreds of thousands of commuter hours. But the project almost instantly ran into some issues. The initial route cut straight through a lot of the state's farmland. Within months, Central Valley farmers filed over 30 separate lawsuits, arguing that the track would hurt their business. Some owners refused to sell at any price, forcing the state into years of eminent domain battles just to access small strips of land. Eventually, the state was forced to adjust the route, but every time that they tried to do that, they'd run into another group that would do everything in their power to block the lines. Cities like Bakersfield blocked the route because it was going to run next to a school, threatening to disrupt children's learning. Then the Planning and Conservation League threatened to sue the government on the grounds that the project violated California's Environmental Quality Act. If that makes all of this sound like an impossible situation, that's because it is. It meant that after more than 15 years, they still haven't completed a single mile of high-speed track, and many are now even calling for the project to be scrapped altogether. Legal battles are only part of the story. The reason American projects cost 5 to 10 times more than in places like France or Japan comes down to the system itself. Complex labor rules, Buy America mandates, and slow procurement rules all push prices upward. Even when a project finally gets approved, states and cities often can't fund it predictably, forcing constant redesigns and delays. And all of this compounds into a cost structure that no other developed country faces. Compare that to a country like South Korea, which in the 90s managed to build their entire KTX high-speed rail network in under 8 years. They were able to do this in large part because the national government could effectively override any local-level complaints without having to go through the entire legal process. And it's not just them. France built 2,700 kilometers of high-speed rail with none of the delays the US sees.